welcome to the Platt Institute webinar. I'm Adam Weinberg, joined by Nicole Fox, Director of Government Relations here at the Platt Institute. We appreciate you joining us for the first of 3 July webinars on the return of the 2020 Nebraska Legislature, which of course was suspended due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to introduce Nicole now, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Adam, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about what we can expect as the Nebraska Legislature gets ready for reconvening for the remaining 17 days of the legislative calendar. A couple of housekeeping things before we begin. First of all, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so using either the chat feature or the question and answer feature down at the bottom of your screen. And also, just to remind you, our webinar today will be recorded, and if you'd like to watch the webinar at a later time, review parts of it, it will be made available on our website, and you can also access it through Facebook and through YouTube. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests for today, Speaker Jim Scheer and Executive Board President Senator Mike Hilgers. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules as we're getting closer to the start of session. Just like the staff here at the Platt Institute, I know a lot of folks are curious as to what we can expect in a few short weeks. So I'm going to just dive right in and get the conversation started. So this question is for both of you, so you can either one of you can jump in. I'll warn you, it's a two-part question. So first of all, how do you see things changing for the remainder of session based on what has happened in the 4 months since the session was suspended? And can you give a 10,000-foot view of your thoughts on priorities for the 2020 Nebraska Legislature for its remaining 17 days?
Well, from my perspective, the changes most notably will be in relation to how the chamber looks and how we will function from a safety protocol basis because of the COVID. So from that vantage point, it will look different. The second part being the prioritized bills, to me, are still my priority. And we still have, I think, probably 15 or so bills that are prioritized that are still in committee. Some of those will come out and we'll be looking at those. My intent is still to try to get every bill that is prioritized, that is out of committee, its time on the floor. I don't guarantee passage of anything, that's not my job. But I do have an obligation to try to get as many, if not all, of the bills that are prioritized on the floor for some discussion. And I'll do my best to get that done.
And I'll add to that. I think that's exactly right. And by the way, thank you, Nicole and Platt Institute, for having us this morning. Look forward to the conversation. I think the speaker's exactly right. I think that the obvious changes are going to be physical changes. They're going to be changes to the structure, and the speaker has provided a memo, as you know, in terms of how that will control and regulate movement on the floor, and from people who intend to lobby the legislature in terms of note passage and the like. In addition, we're working on protocols to help each individual office maintain public access as well as safety. So I think there will be some physical changes. I think beyond that, it's a really kind of a unique social experiment in a way, in that we've had such a long layoff. And typically, when you have a long layoff, it's the interim, and then you come in and sort of, we don't know what bills are going to get introduced, or we have some little bit of an idea. But here we have a very good idea, not just of the bills that have been introduced, but the bills that we will debate on the floor. As the speaker just said, it's going to be priority bills, and we won't probably have time for everything, depending on how the schedule moves. And so I don't think in a lot of ways, beyond the physical, much has changed, although certainly with the economic environment and the impact of the budget and some of those details, we will know a little bit more in July when the forecasting board comes back on the 23rd. And beyond that, it'll be interesting to see how the intervening 4 months and the relationships and conversations between senators may or may not impact movement of particular bills. But beyond that, it's sort of, we go back to where we were in March before we broke, and we kind of know what's going to be in front of us bill-wise.
Okay, and so just to clarify, because I know there was a media question in regards to any of the bills that were still in committee at the time that we had to, the legislature had to adjourn. So even if there are priority bills that remain in committee, the hope is that if the committee can agree and get them out in a, in an okay fashion and get them on general file, that you do hope to schedule them for debate.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Great. All right. Well, on to the next question. So technically there are 17 session days remaining, but with the Revenue Forecast Board meeting on July 23rd, as Senator Hilgers mentioned, and the logistics of voting on final reading bills, how many days does the legislature really have to get major legislative priorities addressed?
Well, if you go from a backtrack, if something were to be passed on day 17 on final reading, we do have a set-aside day. So there's day 16. So the last day that you could have something pass on select and have a chance of it passing on final would indeed be day 15. So to a certain extent, as far as movement, and if you go back one more day, anything on general would have to be moved to select on day 14 in order for it to be able to be back on day 15 to pass on select, have a set aside, and then passed on day 17. So it's not a full 17 days because obviously I can't take something up on select on day 17 because we are not going to be able to pass it. It still has a day of layover.
Perfect. All right. Anything to add, Senator Hilgers? Nope.
Nothing to add. The perfect answer, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Moving on, you have asked that senators with priority bills that negatively impact the general fund consider ways to amend those bills to eliminate that impact for them to move forward. What key priority bills does this request apply to? And at this point, do you know if senators have been able to find paths forward for those bills with fiscal notes?
Well, I think any bill that we send a note out in relationship to that, that's a key bill to whoever's introduced the bill. So at this point in time, they're all prioritized bills. They're all important bills. I can't tell you if they've had amendments drawn that would minimize or eliminate those costs. We will know better the financial position of the state as of the 23rd when the forecasting board meets, and I suspect we'll recertify some type of a number for us to try to benchmark. At that point in time, we'll have to take a strong look at those bills that still have a financial impact on the general fund, because as I've done the previous 3 years, I don't see that it makes sense to spend money that we don't have. And if that is the case, as we have in the previous 3 years, you may get something to select, but you won't get it on final if it has a financial implication on the general fund. We're just not going to spend money we don't have.
And I would just add, anecdotally, at least, I with the speaker, I'm not sure who precisely has drawn up amendments and to what degree those amendments would even be introduced, but I certainly can speak anecdotally that the senators that I've spoken with understand the fiscal state of play, and I think I think many, if not all, are taking prudent action to try to address that very clear fiscal impact and what the speaker just said. So I would expect, although I can't definitively say, but I would expect that there would be amendments for those types of bills to ensure that they could get passed if they can, retain their structure without a fiscal note.
Okay, perfect. And I'm going to kind of, as we say in the legislature, Christmas tree some questions here, because I had a question and a couple of our viewers have very similar questions. So speaking of amendments, we do anticipate that there will be amendments introduced to bills. And a lot of them could be in relation to addressing issues that have arisen because of the pandemic. A viewer said, yeah, but I've heard a lot about the Christmas treeing of bills to add recent topics such as police reform to bills. Will this be allowed? Or I guess, yeah.
Well, I think the answer, you have to have a more specific question. If the material has been heard in a hearing, then it may be introduced as an amendment. If you are introducing new topic that has not been in a hearing, you can certainly try to introduce it, but it will have to go back and have a hearing before the bill would be able to move forward, if that's the case, because our rules specify that all material has to have had a hearing, and I'm not going to change the rules to facilitate that. We would have enough time to have hearings for some of those items, but in fairness to the general public, they need to have an opportunity to weigh in on any of those items that would be incorporated in a bill. So that's the necessity for the hearing. And I will still require that new material has to have been heard previously in a hearing in order for it to be part of an amendment.
Okay.
And I would only add, just from a practical perspective, that we are prepared to have hearings. We've worked with the legislative staff to ensure that there is at least a hearing room that could be utilized and allow for social distancing and allow the public to be heard. And so, to the extent that there is a hearing under what the speaker just said, we would be able to accommodate that hearing.
Okay. And will that information regarding hearings for those from the public that want to attend, I'm assuming that will be posted on the legislature's website?
It'll be posted publicly, just like if it happened to be January 10th, the hearing schedule will be posted publicly so that they have knowledge and can attend if they wish.
Okay. And then another question that's arisen is, do you see any discussion of a state COVID-19 business liability protection discussion happening in the shortened end of the session or very early in next year's session?
Well, I can't speak to next year because I will not be here.
Yeah.
As far as this year, again, that would be new material, and if it were introduced, judiciary would have to have had a hearing, or will have to have a hearing in order for that to be part of a bill under their jurisdiction.
Okay.
And I would say I would anticipate a bill, and I don't say this because I intend to carry one or have one draft. I mean, we're focused on next session or the remainder of this session, but given the level of conversation both among senators that I've spoken to, as well as business owners and groups that represent business owners, this is a very important issue to try to resolve as a number of business owners remain fearful about opening up in a way that might expose themselves to liability. So having some certainty there, I think there's some hope, although it may be dim hope, but there's certainly some hope that some of this may be addressed at the federal level. But I think even whatever happens at the federal level, there would likely be a push at the state level. And I think given the timing concerns that the speaker just articulated, that the earliest that would likely happen, if it were to happen at all, would be in January.
Senator Hilgers, Speaker Scheer, on the subject of hearings and public involvement, we take great pride in Nebraska that the public is able to engage on all of the legislative bills that come before the legislature and hearings, but this is a unique time. We're here having a discussion online about the business of the legislature. Have you internally had any discussions about whether technology could be utilized in this post-COVID environment to allow the public to be more involved with the legislature or for the legislature's business to be operated?
Well, I think we have made improvements, at least in the time that I've been here. We have had distance testifying in other locations other than in person in the hearing rooms. That's taken place quite often. So that still has the ability, if somebody's out in Scottsbluff or in Bloomfield or wherever it might be, they usually have the opportunity to go to another location to testify that wouldn't necessarily be in Lincoln. So I do believe that will continue to be part of the process, and as technology and the equipment is modified, I suspect that will become more prevalent.
And I would say, and I think using technology where we can to increase access for the public, I think is a very prudent thing to do. There has been some discussion, I know, and it's been publicly reported about whether or not we could, for instance, use technology to meet as a legislature, as one example, or potentially even close offices and allow, you know, sort of a broad-based access only through Zoom or telephone or the like. And when it comes to the floor, that's been well documented. I think there's some dispute, but my view is that we have to be in person under the Constitution and our rules. We have to be there if we want to meet. And I also think, as a matter of principle and a matter of policy, that allowing, especially for a unicameral, that is the very premise of our institution, is that there's a second house, the people who have access to us. And even though Zoom is good, and I've been on plenty of Zoom meetings, I'm sure as many of the individuals on this particular call have, and I think it can increase access to some degree. I think it is critically important and foundational to our system to allow the second house to be able to speak in person to their representatives, to be able to reach them in person, and their staff to be able to discuss bills and lobby on their behalf. And so even though I think there's a significant role for technology, and I think I would anticipate that members of the Rules Committee and the body, in particular those who are coming back next year, to look at how we can better use technology to increase access to the public. My personal view is, and I think this is probably widely shared by a number of individuals in the body, that whatever we do has to retain a significant in-person element. And certainly we can take safety precautions and masks and the like to ensure that we're not endangering the public, but I think ultimately it's a foundational part of our system to be there in person, and I think we need to be.
All right, thank you, and I appreciate all your efforts to try and accommodate that, because I agree with you. It's very important that people be heard and be able to speak up on issues of importance to them. So speaking of issues of importance, we understand that each of you are participating in the legislature's group of 10 senators that are working to discuss a way forward for the incentives bill, the next project, and property taxes. And is the group coming to a consensus? And are there details that you can share, if so, as to how those meetings are going with today's audience?
Well, I am participating in a group trying to formulate something. As far as, is there consensus? At this point, I would say no. There's a lot of different viewpoints. Any proposal that has been brought forward has plus and minuses, regardless if it happens to be the property tax portion or an incentive package portion. So my hope is that we would have something to move forward with. To be candid, I don't believe that there are 33 votes for a property tax bill to have a cloture vote. I don't believe there are 33 for an incentive bill at this point in time. So if and 1084 is been discussed, but I don't know that it as well would have 33 votes to move forward. So in order for things to move forward, it probably has to be somewhat of a combination that everyone will get something out of and be able to move forward. Will that happen? That's the $64,000 question. Don't know. The bills, all those, two of the bills are prioritized, can move forward on their own if they wish. And if that's the will of the bill introducer, then that's probably what's going to happen. At this point in time, I wouldn't state that we have a consensus on any of the bills that we've been discussing as far as moving forward in any particular fashion.
I don't have much more to add to that other than I think the speaker's observations are exactly right. I mean, I think hard things are hard things for a reason. I think if these were easy solutions, they would have been solved a long time ago, or they would have been solved certainly in the first session of this 2-year biennium. And so I can say that the working group, at least that have met, we've had good conversations, candid conversations, and I think everyone who's in that room is at least putting forth their best effort to try to listen to each other and try to find a path forward. That doesn't always mean that there is one or that we can find it, but I feel like there's a good group in that room, and we'll see where we go in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Yeah, because there was somebody from the media that did ask, when it comes to, I know Speaker Scheer, you mentioned that there probably aren't 33 votes for any of those three bills. And a question from the media is, what do you think is the most significant obstacle to getting those bills over the finish line? Do you think it's opposition of the school districts? Do you think it's just the lack of, not a whole lot of time in general? Or do you think it's a revenue issue?
Well, personally, I just think it's a change issue.
Mm-hmm.
All of the things you've talked about are part of the change, regardless of any of the bills that it's not, and that's not just isolated to a property tax bill or an incentive bill. Most bills are changing something, and the big discussion usually ends up being, is the change worthwhile? And the bills that you've talked about, there are more larger, more radical changes to some of the contents of how we do business in a state, either from an incentive package basis or a school funding and property tax relief basis. So, I'd like to say a lot of it has to do with compromise, but sometimes the beliefs are not compromisable. People have their root thoughts, and sometimes those just aren't able to align with others. So therein lies, the problem with trying to find 33 senators on any of those items to move the bill forward.
Okay. Senator Hilgers?
Nothing really to add to that. I think that from the framing with both these bills, there's lots of there's objections to both from different individual senators, but if you were to try to put them under one bigger umbrella, I think that what the speaker said is exactly right.
A lot of reasons. Okay. And kind of talking about, concerns about, revenue shortfalls, have either of you had any discussions with Nebraska's federal delegation about the likelihood and timing, if any, additional federal aid that could be used for any budget shortfalls?
I've had a couple of discussions with a couple members of our delegation, and if there is something coming, I don't anticipate it probably happening before we get into session. And to be honest, I'm not sure that anything happens before we get out of session either. And, that's a very fluid situation. We can talk about it and we don't think anything's going to happen, and they could pass something Friday and, move forward. So I've talked to them, but I don't have any information that would lead me to believe that they're going to provide anything additional than what we have at this point in time. And I don't know that if they believe that there would be some additional funds, I don't think the format of that has been worked out at all at this point in time.
I would add, I had some conversations, but it's earlier this summer, and I will tell you with how fast moving and fluid, as the speaker said, this is, anything more than a week old, frankly, is probably a little stale in this universe. I do know when I have those conversations, I think there was probably a little bit more of a dim hope that there would be new dollars, but that there might be some hope. And I'm not suggesting great hope. And again, it's a couple weeks old, but that maybe that the dollars that the state has received already could be used for a more broad purposes than currently is the case. And so, whether or not that happens, I think is up in the air. I agree with the speaker, though. I think it's sitting here on July 1st. I probably wouldn't bet that would happen before our session, but at the same time, things have happened, seemingly not had any action, and then 48 hours later, something passes Congress. So I think that's where we sit as of today.
Okay, thank you so much. Question from an attendee, Mr. Speaker, will you continue with a consent calendar for non-controversial issues?
At this point, I'm not necessarily planning on it. If I have a big surprise that things are moving pretty quickly, I certainly will consider that, because I think there are some things out there that are non-controversial and they're not prioritized, and it would be nice to have moved. But at this point in time, truly, my thoughts are strictly on the priority of legislation and with the time element. And again, realizing that part of the change in the legislature will be we used to be able to try to go towards that magic midnight, towards the end of short sessions to utilize a full day up. In order for us to be able to clean the chamber each night and be operational by 9 o'clock the following morning, 10 o'clock is sort of my drop dead time. So we will lose some of that time. Not that we went till midnight every night. I'm not trying to imply that. But we will lose some of the availability of that optional time that we would have had. So we will still be going, I'll be using time as wisely as I can and functionally. We will be going to 10 o'clock on several evenings. I can't say that necessarily all the evenings, but as far as being able to have a consent agenda, chances of that are probably smaller than larger, but I won't necessarily rule it out because I don't know how the session will transform once we start back on July 20th.
Okay, great. One more question from media. So I know you kind of hinted earlier about there's concern that there may not be the 33 votes needed to get the major business tax incentive bill across the finish line. What will that mean for Nebraska's future economic development climate? If either of you would like to tackle that one.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't, one, who knows? It is not going to be positive because I personally would like us not to have incentives to encourage businesses to come to Nebraska. But the reality is every other state, the other 49 states all have some type of an incentive package. And you need to be somewhat competitive to attract business to come to your state and set up shop and develop and spur your economy and growth on and bring employees and tax revenues to the state. But in the last 120 days, a lot has happened. I don't think that any state is going to be extremely flush with dollars to go out and try to recruit and steal other businesses from other states. But I would like to have something in place for the state to have as far as an incentive package. I think it's important to have that. I think it's important to have property tax relief. And I'll be more than happy to vote for those, but we have to be able to find some way to get those passed and reach that magical number of 33. My concern is that we need to do something with property taxes, and I would like to see that done first. And by combining those, we take away the fear of, okay, one's going to get it and then the other one's not going to pass. And I think there is some concern on perhaps some senators' part that if one passes, the other one wouldn't. And so it would be nice to be able to eliminate that fear by placing them together and providing a package that everyone can be assured that that portion that they're extremely interested in will be able to be passed as well.
Okay.
I would add from the incentives perspective, I think everything else being equal, if we were in a normal world, certainly not having incentives in the competitive environment around the country would hurt the state. There's no doubt about that, I think. And I'm with the speaker. I'd prefer not to have them. I would prefer that that's not the game that the states are involved in, but the reality is what it is. I will say that it is an open question to what degree the impact that COVID has had on state budgets and the turmoil it's created over the next year, or the near term at least, it's impacting states in what degree we aren't exactly sure. But I do think that everything isn't equal. And so I certainly think that it may mitigate it if it doesn't pass, but I'm not, I certainly wouldn't count on that. But I do think that's a variable that we ought to consider very closely. At the same time, though, I will say that we should be thinking and being forward thinking about the opportunities that this might present for Nebraska to grow our population base and the businesses here. You certainly are seeing efforts or discussion, at least, of bringing our manufacturing base from overseas back to the United States and domesticate that. I think Nebraska, in many ways, is well positioned to take advantage of that. I also think you're seeing turmoil in a lot of places around the country. And certainly, I will tell you, I recruit nationally, anecdotally, and there are people who maybe 3 months ago thought to themselves they would never leave New York City, or they would never would leave the Bay, or they might not leave Minneapolis. And I think as you see both the impact of COVID and some of the turmoil in various urban centers around the country, I think Nebraska is positioned to potentially grow its state population-wise and business-wise. So I think we need to be forward-thinking, innovative, and proactive there. And I think the incentives package plays a big role as part of that. And I would agree with the speaker. I think we don't always think, or maybe don't often think of property tax as a business development tool or an economic development tool, but I think it very clearly is when you're able to give families more money in their pocket, and then families and parents and grandparents are more likely to stay in the state. That helps ground our population base, helps avoid erosion of our population base. And when you can give small business owners and entrepreneurs more money in their pocket to be able to start those businesses or grow them and survive cash flow dips like they're probably having today with COVID, there's a direct tie between that. And so I think they're both very important to our state. And I'm with the speaker. I'd like to see them both get done this year, and I'm still hopeful that will be the case.
All right, and kind of a couple of questions along the lines of incentives. We've got some questions that have rolled in. Senator Friesen introduced a bill this session, LB 1034, that would extend the Nebraska Advantage Act by 1 year. Is there any possibility, to your knowledge, that bill's being considered should LB 20 not pass, 720 not pass?
I'm sure at some point in time it might be, but again, it's not prioritized, so it would have to be an amendment to some bill that it would be germane to. So there's an instance that, yes, it did have a hearing, and yes, it could be amendable, but just because it's an amendment doesn't necessarily mean that it would pass as well. I think if we do nothing at all in relationship to the incentives and property tax, is the body going to want to extend something a year? You know, again, your guess is probably as good as mine. A lot of things have changed over the last 120 days, so is a possibility? You know, certainly possibility is a probability. I think probably less of a probability than a possibility.
Yeah, I would agree with the speaker. I think there can be some facial appeal to that. I think when you first look at it, oh, we'll just extend it for a year. But if you talk to people who are close to the economic incentives and how they actually work, and certainly how businesses that take advantage of those incentives to move their businesses here or grow jobs here, there really isn't a solution, because incentives work on a pretty long time horizon. And businesses look for certainty. And so if we just do it for a year, one, that doesn't solve the time horizon problem, because you really just kicked it out a year, but you haven't extended beyond that. But also, two, it is certainly not certain. What you have done is you've probably injected more uncertainty, because it's sort of you're straddling two paths. And so if businesses out there are looking around for stability, safe harbor, certainty, just a year extension, I don't think gets the job done. So I think there's been a lot of even though there might be some initial facial appeal, if you sort of first think of that as a solution, I think there's a lot of resistance to that. I also would say, sort of akin to that, I think there's a lot of resistance to sort of solving the property tax problem by trying to just put more money into the property tax credit fund. So I think those are two quote unquote solutions that I at least perceive where the body sits as of July 1st of this year. Of course, as the speaker noted, things can change and often do, certainly once time starts to run out. But I think sitting here today, those two are not solutions that have much support, if any, quite candidly, within the body.
Okay. And then last incentive question, and I know Senator Hilgers, you kind of alluded to this about, trying to, bring some of the overseas manufacturing to Nebraska. Do either of you feel that the incentive proposal should be amended to attract more medical manufacturing companies or expansions here in our state?
I really would prefer to have an incentive package that is open to all business incentives, regardless of what they may or may not be manufacturing. I think as well, if you look at an incentive package, I think if we're starting to look at technology and how businesses have changed. If we're going to be providing this incentive to a business, that employee not only should be functionally paid in Nebraska, they should be residing in Nebraska. If we're going to provide an incentive for an employee, that employee should be a resident of the state of Nebraska. And to my knowledge right now, that is not the case. I think it's an assumption, but I think we need to start looking more at what the bill says logistically and make sure that we are actually incentivizing the type of growth that we would want. Those are fine-tuned things and can be done, I think, fairly easily. But anything that was written 120 days ago, I think people have been able to notice how the economy has made businesses change and probably need to reassess exactly how we are determining those bills from an incentive standpoint.
I would add, certainly as a matter of principle, I agree with the speaker. I would say I've had a few conversations with stakeholders at 720. There's no suggested tweak or change that at least from those conversations that I've observed that would be recommended to capture or pull in those additional industries. I will tell you what the incentive packages are tools and they do apply across industries. And what matters in a lot of these instances are you got to have the tools in place, but then ultimately you need to also have fundamental aspects of your economy to be able to support these businesses. You have a good education system, labor system, access to, transportation infrastructure. But then you need to have a really solid, energetic, coordinated recruiting effort. I mean, a lot of these are sales. Ultimately, they boil down to sales. A lot of people are recruiting these businesses all over the country, and you need to have good, energetic leadership in that regard. So I've been impressed with the leadership that we've seen from the Economic Development Department. And so if we have these tools from the incentive package in place, I think we've got in Omaha and Lincoln and some of the greater Nebraska communities, I think there is the sort of sales infrastructure, as it were, to go out and try to pitch and recruit these companies. I think we're well positioned to do it. We need the tools, and we have the other resources. And I think just then we need to add the leadership to go and make it happen. The only thing I would say beyond that, it's not incentive based, but I think anytime you're talking about building businesses in a state or a location, your tax and regulatory regime really matter. I'm firmly of the belief, and it's part of the reasons why incentives are important, but our tax burden is incredibly high for property tax, the income tax, corporate taxes. I think it's a discouragement. I think it's a discouragement to business formation. I think it's a discouragement to business growth as an entrepreneur myself. And none of that is in any of the property tax bill certainly, but that's more of a plug for long-term change in our state that I think would do more good to actually business formation and driving business growth in our state than many other things would.
Okay. And because we're kind of talking about the difficulty of getting, needed reforms moved forward, do you think Nebraska's filibuster threshold prevents the opportunity to move that reform forward? And do you believe the legislature should review this next session?
Well, yeah, I think it gets reviewed every 2 years. Is it good or bad? I suppose it depends on which side of the fence you're on what particular bill. From my vantage point, the 33 threshold is protecting the minority interests. And if something attracts enough opposition, should 25 always prevail? I don't think so. I think sometimes 25 can be put together pretty easily, and that doesn't mean that it's a good bill or a fair bill. It just means that you have attracted 24 other senators through either providing something to them and relief to one of their bills or something else. So I think what you have now, although I didn't like it as much when I first came as I probably appreciate it now, I think sometimes having that minority control makes sense. Now, is the number need to be modified? Should it be 33? Should it be 30? Should it be 35? I don't know. I mean, those are unilateral. Those are something that obviously can be changed. I think that it does serve a purpose, and the number could be adjusted, but quite honestly, right now, I think it serves a purpose and it functionally helps the state, because too many times I think some things could get rolled past pretty quickly at 25 that probably shouldn't or wouldn't.
Yeah, I would add that, especially in a unicameral, but certainly even in other legislative bodies, having a filibuster, I think, is an important speed bump to ensuring that, to the speaker's point, that legislation just doesn't fly through and that the minority has some say. There's no doubt about it. I do think that having a filibuster with some threshold above 25 is an important limitation that encourages compromise and dialogue. I think in the absence of it, if it simply was a bare majority, I think you would have much more Washington, D.C. style, just partisan politics of driving things through the body. That being said, I do have some criticism of the filibuster in the sense that it's not always, I think it requires, in my view, it should require, if it's something so important that you want to protect the minority rights to kill a bill, that you ought to vote on it. And one of my biggest frustrations, not just in the last 4 years, but also in the years previous, with just observing the legislature, was that people could kill bills by not being there for a filibuster vote or not voting on a filibuster vote. And so I supported in 2017 the concept of ensuring that at least you'd have some people vote on that, even if you kept the 33, and you could do that through a number of different mechanisms, one of which was one that was proposed a couple years ago, which was the Red 17 concept, which I know is a little more unorthodox what we've seen, but essentially say, hey, you got to vote no in order to kill a bill. Wouldn't change the threshold. Another way would do it would be 2/3. You wouldn't change the threshold, but it'd be 2/3 of those voting. So, those kind of reforms I certainly would be supportive and would look at, because I do think that the idea that people can kill bills by not voting or just not being there, I think I don't think is the right signal to Nebraska. And I also doesn't think it helps the system. But I do think having a filibuster, I think you've even seen the conversations in D.C. over the last couple of weeks, which in my view are incredibly troubling. Some discussion of getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. I just think, I think there's a level of discussion, dialogue, compromise, work that is done that would not be done if you just had majority rule every time.
Great insight, both of you, because I agree. You kind of have to realize or think about what side of the issue you're on, because it works different ways depending on if you're trying to move something forward, or if you're trying to block legislation that you think is not worthy of moving forward. Switching over a little bit to some budget stuff. Will the legislature review the unappropriated COVID funds, and will the budget be amended?
Well, we still have a interim budget adjustment bill that is on the floor. I believe it's at select right now. And will there be some changes proposed? I suspect there will be. I don't know exactly what those may be. And again, it still takes, an amendment, it's still going to take 25 votes to change that. So I'm not sure what those may be, if they're COVID related or not. I suspect there will be some that will be. And we'll have to see how that plays out when it gets to the floor.
Okay.
The only thing I would add is I keep getting on my screen a very helpful schedule of events for the Platt Institute. It looks like July 15th is Chairman Stinner. So I'd encourage everyone to sign up for that webinar. I'll be listening in, and maybe you can ask him that question and get his thoughts then.
Yep.
We appreciate that. And everybody, if you couldn't see the graphic before, it's over my shoulder here. It should be popping up in a minute there, and you can register for those at plattinstitute.org/events.
Yep. All right, we have a couple more questions here from attendees. Are there plans for the legislature to provide oversight over or input on how the federal funds are being spent by the governor in response to the pandemic?
Well, the dollars were sent to the governor's office federally, and part of the emergency decree that the governor has instituted, and by statute he's allowed to do, so it's not that he did it unilaterally. The legislature at some point in time put those items in statute that allows him to do what he's doing. Should that be changed? That's another question. And we certainly can do that, but I think right now, what has happened with relationship to the governor utilizing and formulating how those funds are distributed are perfectly legal and within the realms of the authority that we as a legislature in previous years have given the governor's office via those emergency decrees. I'm sure we'll have some discussions in regards to that, but I'm not necessarily sure that we really have ultimately the control over those dollars that have been previously sent to the governor, and we have authorized as a legislature the ability to be spent.
Okay. And one last attendee question here, and I know that this is it's a lot of speculation. Is there a chance that the 2021 session will be delayed if we have a second wave of the virus this winter? And I know nobody has a crystal ball, but that is a question that an attendee asked. So I'll let you guys give your insight.
Well, honestly, I guess I'm not exactly sure because normally the speaker would do that, but the speaker will not be elected until it reconvenes. So I don't know if they literally have to reconvene for a day to provide leadership in order to make that determination. It's a good question. I don't know the answer, to be quite honest.
Any thoughts, Senator Hilgers?
Well, constitutionally, we have to start on the second Wednesday after the first one, whatever the convoluted math is. I should know it by heart, but it's whenever. It's not just when the Speaker Scheer says it is constitutionally mandated when we show up. So I think, but there's no mandate as to when we might end. So I think if that were to happen, I think the mechanism, the body would still have to constitutionally make a leadership decision and then suspend it from there. Beyond that, I think whether or not something like that would happen or would need to happen, I think is obviously it would be speculation on my part. I think as we proceed through this thing, every week, every day, it's changed. I mean, on the plus side, we had a period of time, and I think even in Nebraska still, where our cases have gone down, certainly around the country, disturbingly over the last couple of weeks, that has changed on other parts of the country. And so even waiting for a second wave in the fall, there might be the formation of one even here this summer. And so we don't know what the world's going to look like in August. We don't know what it's going to look like in September. I will say that there's at least some positive things on the vaccine front, at least some hope potentially that we could have a vaccine by the end of the year. It might be a little optimistic, but I think that time horizon has shortened a little bit since when this thing started, which I think is very good news. I also think that there's potential that over the next several months, I think there might be momentum to not shut down the economy again. I think that shutting down our system and our economy over the time that we did, I think that is, I think a lot of folks are looking and saying, hey, look, we got to see how we can do this safely without shutting it down. So I think there's going to be maybe a different outlook on shutting things down in January than there is today. All those elements, there could be the sweet meteor of death that comes in October that people joke about sometimes. Who knows? I mean, the way that 2020 has gone so far, speculating what might look like in January 2021 is just that. It's just speculation. But I would, if you asked me to bet on it today, I would probably bet that we would move forward in January. But there's so much between now and then. It would just be speculation.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Senator Hilgers. And last night I heard something about a potential swine flu that might be coming. So who knows? Who knows? Expect the unexpected. Adam, I have one last question here from an attendee, but it's kind of lighthearted. And I just wanted to check in with you if you had any more questions roll in on your end.
Yeah, do you want me to do a dramatic reading of this one? Because it's a pointed question. It's
I'm not sure he's joking. I can see it.
No, I think he's serious, but it's presented. So the question goes: incentives, property tax, blah blah blah. What are you doing to ensure there's a full college football season this year with 89,000 fans in Memorial Stadium? I suppose that's for both panelists.
Mine is a real simple answer: nothing. Not our call, not my decision. I suspect that they will try to normalize the college campus as quickly as possible and deemed safe. And the state has done a good job. The residents have done a good job of somewhat containing the infection rate in the state, and certainly those that are infected and hospitalized. We've been some of the smallest numbers nationally. So, as we move forward, as we continue to behave as a body and show some social distancing and try to keep everyone as safe as possible, perhaps that will happen. But that's 90,000 people in a very small proximity area. And I'd hate to make it a season of one and done because everybody didn't behave the first time that 90,000 people were attracted in a stadium. And that's a pretty high percentage of the state's population that could be whacked in one outing. So it's in jest, yeah, I'd like to be able to say that we're going to have a football season. Two, it's not our call, either Mike or I's, but more importantly, I just want to make sure that we try to keep the state of Nebraska residents as safe as possible.
Yeah.
Well, if Coach Frost wants to give the speaker or me a call and make a request of something that would help ensure we have the season, hey, I'm all ears. The speaker's right, though. But I will say, I think the speaker is being a little bit not recognizing of his own efforts here. I think we can control what we can control, and I think individually and as families or as business owners, we can help control what we do as a social distancing, good hygiene and mask wearing and all the things that the experts are telling us to do. The speaker made a tough decision, but it was the right decision in March to suspend. That impacted, frankly, hundreds of people, and when you include their families, no exaggeration to say thousands of people, ensuring that we were not a potential hotbed of the virus spreading in March. And in addition to that, he's worked very diligently listening to the experts to create a system that will look a little different. If you looked at the chamber floor, it does not look like it normally does, and it will not work like it normally has, but it's meant to ensure the safety and help protect not just the members themselves, but the staff, the people working the Capitol, as well as the lobbyists and the people who have interest in the legislation that's before us. So I think the speaker, we can only control what we can control, and I think the speaker has had a lot of people within his responsibility, and I think he's done absolutely the right things to help ensure that we're fulfilling our constitutional obligations. We have a responsibility and duty to the people of Nebraska to get our jobs done, but at the same time doing it in a safe and effective manner that protects the people who work there. So speaker's done quite a bit, and if that plays a little role in making sure we got football come September, hey, then we'll feel good about that. But
yeah, I'm gonna play a little devil's advocate and say I think maybe the decision might be made by the NCAA. That would be my guess, especially since you're talking about teams traveling from other states, kind of like the March Madness and basketball tournament and everything. But I know there's a lot of people hoping that there's still going to be football, and I get it. So anyway, thank you guys both so much. Adam, just one last check. No questions have rolled in on your end?
No, thanks for everybody's questions today, and we'll look forward to having you at our next webinar. We have two coming up in the two next weeks, so please look for those at plattinstitute.org/events. And if you're interested in the property tax issue, which if you're Nebraskan, many of you are, of course, we do have a series of virtual property tax town halls in communities across the state. We'd encourage you to join those for your community so that we can hear your ideas about what ought to be done with property tax reform in Nebraska. So look for those at plattinstitute.org/events.
All right. Well, once again, Speaker Scheer and Senator Hilgers, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day. We know you've got some long days ahead. Thanks for serving Nebraskans. Thanks for your leadership. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank those of you that participated in today's webinar. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, you can go back and review our webinar because it is recorded, and that is available on our website. It's also available on Facebook, and it's available on YouTube. And just another kind of quick housekeeping note, when you exit the webinar, there will be a survey at the end, and we do appreciate your feedback for future webinars. And then, as Adam mentioned, we will have a second in our legislative series, a second webinar next Wednesday featuring Senator Linehan and Platt CEO Jim Vocal. They'll be discussing the revenue landscape and tax policy. So again, thanks again to everybody. This concludes our webinar. Have a great rest of your day and a happy 4th of July. We'll see you next week.
Thanks so much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having us.
gentlemen.